Christopher, hello. It's late at night here in Sydney in Australia, and you're in Canada, and it's early in the morning, and we are here to do an interview for Aotearoa Musical Treasures. So, Christopher, my first memory of you was sitting in the audience and listening to you playing in the final of the New Zealand National Concerto competitions. But I want to know how you got to that particular point. So you grew up in Dunedin, which is sort of near the bottom of New Zealand for those people who are listening internationally to this. And I've seen a picture of your parents who look like film stars. So let's start at the beginning.
Well, I in fact was born in Aotearoa and grew up in Auckland until I was 12. My parents. Well, my father in particular was in the army, so we're in Papakura. Actually, prior to that, we're in Wairuru. So I'm an army kid, and then at the age of 12, my father decided, having undergone some kind of religious conversion in his time in the army, decided to become a minister of the Presbyterian Church and trained as a minister at the age of 40 in Dunedin. So I went to Dunedin at that point. But I'd been obviously spotted as musical boy by my mother because we didn't have a piano, but I used to fill milk bottles with water and play things on that. I was greatly interested in the music played on the radio and on our records. And she finally decided she'd better get me lessons. And at the age of 8, I started with lessons with nuns in Auckland, and I think must have gone through all the Trinity exams. And then came to Dunedin and continued my piano studies. But by that time, I'd become voraciously interested in classical music and devoured everything I could find, and discovered certain composers really interested me. And one of the big ones, in fact, was Nielsen. And I remember at the age of 12, scores arriving from Denmark of the Nielsen symphonies. So yeah, I was a sort of slightly unusual child in that regard. There was no music in my family. And my parents.
You'd certainly come a long way from the milk bottles. Can I just backtrack for a second? Because you were so involved in many different things, but certainly in early, piano tuition and so on, and recognised all the way around the world for what you've contributed there. But I just want you to, I don't think you can just brush over your first lessons with the nuns. Do you have many memories of those lessons?
Not straight. I thought they were nice people. They were good musicians. Many of the nuns who taught in those days. I'm sure they are still. And what I chiefly remember is that my mother took me to the convent. And she just heard that they did piano teaching, and she said to the nun, "My son seems very musical. Would you be prepared to take him on as a student?" And they said, "We're full, really." And she said, "Would you hear him play?" And I played for the nun, and to this day I don't know what I would have played because I hadn't had any lessons yet. I was obviously able to play the piano before I had lessons somehow. I think probably playing on pianos at our local church or something. Anyway, the nun heard me and said, "We'll make a space for him. You only get a handful of students like this in a lifetime." That was a lovely comment from her. But as to the actual detail of the lessons, I don't remember. It's just I soaked it all up. I found music reading instantly made sense, and I played by ear, particularly for church, even at that very young age. So I both read music and played by ear.
Now, so many of your pieces are in exam syllabuses, so we can't, we can't brush past the fact that you might possibly have done exams in those early stages. Do you have any memories of those exams or not?
Well, I did exams up to LTCL, I think, and in fact, I think I got offered the chance to take a scholarship up to go and study in London. So I obviously went through all the grades. One of my teachers in Dunedin, when I got to Dunedin, was the city organist. I think his name was Alan Meldrum, and I was also taught by a wonderful teacher called William Clark. I'm hoping I remember the names right. And finally, I ended up at the University of Otago and it was Maurice Till. So I had quite a variety of teachers, and I don't think many of them knew quite what to make of it because I was interested in such a weird selection of music. I remember at the age of 15, I said I'd like to learn the Bloch piano sonata, and I was doing the Nielsen Chaconne at that point, and was greatly taken with Szymanowski as well. So I had no sort of rules as to what kind of music I explored or wanted to play on the piano.
I think Morris probably never had a student quite like that ever again. I mean,
well, in fact, I was a bit unlucky because I went through Otago at the same time as Michael Houston and Richard Mapp. And of course, I heard Michael Houston play. He was an undergraduate in the same year as me, and I thought, he's better. You know what I mean? I mean, there are some people who've just got a real sort of pianistic flair. But I like playing the piano, but I like playing the piano as a medium for music, for myself, if you like. And of course, started composing about the age of 14 under the tutelage of one of your interviewees, of course, Rosemary Miller, as she was then. And that unlocked something which had been kind of lurking there all along, the notion that I might write my own music.
And tell me, do you have any copies of those early pieces?
I do. In fact, I've still got manuscripts of a piece I think written, it's one called Anachronomy, which was actually designed to be anachronistic and was a kind of sonata form piece, which is still quite good actually. And I wrote various pieces, like there's a set of Bush pieces for piano, which were quite like Lilburn, I would say. So I was sort of exploring all sorts of things, including quite atonal music, as I hadn't really come across pop music at that point. You'll be interested to hear. I didn't really listen to pop music seriously until I was pretty much at university. So it was all classical music all the way for me until perhaps the age of 16.
And was there a point where you, just going back to being an undergraduate with Michael Houston, do you think that made you lift your game even higher, or was it you were already going in such different paths?
What made me raise my game even higher, I think, was going to Wellington after I finished my degree. I started my music degree at the age of 16, unusually, because I got you were able to sit university bursary exams in those days, and I was able to go to university early, so I went then and was graduated by the time I was 19, and I moved to Wellington and became a high school music teacher. But I also picked up for the first time my first real piano teacher, you might say, and that was Barry Morgan, whose name you must know, and he was fantastic. And I did the Prokofiev concerto, which you referred to, with Barry Morgan, and I was a full-time school music teacher, and I ended up going for lessons at something like 6 o'clock in the morning on my way to school. So it was amazing. But he was a brutal teacher in a good way. And I remember one infamous occasion where I was playing a very hard passage from this Prokofiev concerto, and I stumbled over it, and he said, "Shut the book." And then he said, "Could you name me the notes of that left-hand passage from memory?" And I did. And then he said, "Now can you name me the fingerings from memory?" And I couldn't. And he said, "Why do you come so badly prepared to lessons?" So by the time I got to the Prokofiev concerto, I couldn't go wrong, because I knew exactly where each finger was going to be going at each particular point. So I've never been a better pianist than when I was with Barry Morgan. He was a wonderful teacher. And I explored quite a lot of repertoire with him as well. But even then, at one point I remember bringing along the fourth piano sonata by Hank Bardings, and him looking quizzically at me, because I think he was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if he'd like to play the Chopin Etudes or something? But I was always kind of going into byways of music as a pianist.
And now, when you hear that Prokofiev piano concerto, does it bring back good memories?
It does. I mean, I really enjoyed doing it. I found it very nerve-wracking, like everybody does, playing piano concertos or piano sonatas or whatever. And also, I read about various people, one of them being Barenboim, who had all the piano sonatas of Beethoven memorized by the time he was 8. And I thought, that's what you're up against. You've got people who've not only got prodigious musical talent, but they've also got phenomenal memories. And so I remember I was offered the chance to do the Sydney International Piano Competition as well, and I said no. I wasn't really interested in furthering a career as a pianist. for various reasons, but one of them is just that I felt as though I wasn't quite up there. But as a result, I've thoroughly enjoyed playing the piano all my life and still enjoy playing it. So I guess, you know, I've not quite had the last laugh, but I've had piano playing as a wonderful thread running through my life, and I'm still doing it for, you know, for pleasure.
And maybe you possibly enjoy playing the piano more than people who've given their life to being a concert pianist and living that life.
Absolutely. I've never had the injuries from overplaying, which is a start.
Now tell me about your school teaching days.
Well, that was interesting because, in fact, in those far off days, back in 1974 or so, I suppose, I had a first class honours degree from Aotearoa, and I got to Wellington because my wife was doing a library qualification, and I just needed a job. And I went along to the department, whatever the department was, and said, I've got this degree in music. Are there any music teaching jobs going? They gave me a list and said, take your pick. And I just went for the first one that came up and walked straight into it. No teachers college, nothing, just straight into music teaching in high school. And what was interesting is that my interest in the Szymanowski First Violin Concerto and the Martineau Sixth Symphony wasn't really matched by my students.
That's the trouble with the Wellington schools.
Well, it was they're all the heavy metal and heavy rock. But fortunately, when I was at Otago University, this is someone else who listeners may know the name. I became very good friends with a guy called George Kay. And George Kay became a very well-regarded rock critic. He wrote for Rip It Up, which you may remember. But he interviewed David Bowie and the Stones and all sorts. But he had a great nose for what was good in pop music or rock music, and said to me, "You're just not listening to the right stuff," and introduced me to loads of things. And one of the seminal things, I was thinking about this only yesterday, fun enough, was the film Mad Dogs and Englishmen, the Joe Cocker film. And I've been listening to Leon Russell's album from 1970 over the last couple of days because he's such a wonderful artist, and he was a big feature of that film. And I suddenly got interested in rock music. And in fact, once I got to Wellington, not only did I do the concerto competition, I joined a band for the first time as a keyboard player. And what was fantastic about that was they knew I could play the piano. They had a very good musician who left the band, and I was asked to join. And they gave me a whole lot of LPs and said, here's a repertoire, and pointed to the tracks on the LPs and said, could you write chord charts for the band, while you're working out the keyboard parts? And just basically I was thrown into transcription just like that, and discovered I loved doing that as well. So I began to explore rock and jazz and pop, and did a wonderful course actually. Now, this is a name you'll know, Mark, in Wellington, run by Colin Hemmingson. Who did a course on jazz improvisation, and I just soaked it up. I loved it. And so I began to realize that there were two strands of my interest, and I was starting to explore rock and pop. And of course, that was perfect timing for my school teaching because the boys were quite interested in that. But on top of that, this is where it gets complicated. After 2 years at Scots College in Wellington, I got a job at Aotearoa College, which was a big co-educational school. Do I say co-education? Girls and boys, anyway. And then I got the job as composer in schools. And that involved me working not only in Tawa, I think it was, but I also worked at Mana College, which was all Polynesian children. And they were interested in a whole other range of music. Stevie Wonder and the Temptations of the Four Tops. In other words, it was black music. So I began to get interested in that as well. And my interest in classical music never waned. So in fact, I was starting to kind of soak up music from all sorts of places, which is really where microjazz came from.
So that's quite a jump from doing what you were doing. So did you think at the time that you were going to stay within the school system teaching, or did you always hanker for something else?
Oh, well, I won a scholarship from the New Zealand government to do a second degree, and I kept deferring it because I was having such a fun time in Wellington. And eventually they said, you got to take it up. And so in 1977, I went to Britain and went to York University to do a degree in composition there. So that was always my aim, I think. deep down, I think my aim was always to be a published composer. I mean, that became clear to me quite early on. And I did have some pieces published by, New Zealand publishers and so on. But I was picked up quite quickly by London publishers after I got to Britain.
So, I mean, that was an extraordinary thing. And how did that exactly happen? Because it's not easy for that to be.
There's so many sort of elements which are pure luck. But one of them was I was at York University, and one of the teachers at York University, one of the professors, was John Painter. Do you know that name?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and he liked what I was doing so much because I did some stuff with him, and he realised what I was about, if you like, that he recommended me to he was a reader for Universal Edition in London, and he said, this guy's very interesting, you might like to try him out for something. And it was on the education side that I was picked up. And the first job I ever got with a London publisher was easy piano duet arrangements of Christmas carols. And what was interesting about it was I got it, this is something like the geography or the history of it, is I got the job on a Friday, and they had the finished manuscript on Monday morning on their desk. And the managing director said to me, I mentioned this idea to the education guy just in passing, and there was the manuscript on Monday. I thought, I'm going to have to go through with this. In other words, if I hadn't moved that quickly, it might not have got picked up as an idea. And then the same education manager said to me, look, Chris, I've got an interesting idea for you. Would you like to try and write some improvisations on Christmas carols? Which became a book called Carol Jazz, which is probably grade 8. And it's still very popular, and I'm still very proud of it. And that was in 1980 or so, I think 1981. And then, this is the big thing, the same guy who was the education person at Universal Edition said to me, look, Chris, here's another idea for you. Would you like to write a set of graded pieces in popular styles? And I was at the Edinburgh Festival that year with the band, and I actually wrote something like 40 pieces over the course of perhaps, I don't know, 2 weeks in Edinburgh. And I got back, and he'd left the company and emigrated to Canada, ironically. And it sat in my bottom drawer for something like 2 years. I had these manuscripts sitting there, and I'd done them and thought I quite like those. And then I taught the piano at York University to undergraduates a little bit. And one of the undergraduates got a job at Boozy and Hawkes as the assistant to the production manager or the publishing manager. And he said to her, we've got a funny little job come up for the World Wildlife Fund. We need somebody to do some arrangements and transcriptions. And she recommended me. They met me, I did it, and then they said, what else have you done? I said, I've got these publications from Universal Edition, and I've got this set of pieces which are graded pieces in popular styles. And I played a few to this guy, and he said to me, this is going to be a gold mine. That was his words, I've never forgotten it. And he named it Microjazz. And what you might not realize is the reason it was called Microjazz was because they published Microcosmos. And they basically wanted to have something which was like a popular version of Microcosmos. And then they marketed the heck out of it, and the rest is history. 3 million sales later.
That's a sort of is an amazing story of coincidences. And so, at what point did you do the other instruments? The clarinet and sax. Well, all the instruments.
Well, the piano books, and what was amazing about those days is Boots and Hawkes sent me to Australia on tour in 1987. And what I'm saying is that publishers in those days were prepared to put money into sending you places even though you didn't have that many books out. And so I began the process of disseminating. But the big thing that happened, of course, was that 2 of the pieces got picked up by the Associated Board in 1987, and it spread out like wildfire because students really liked these particular pieces, and they still like them. One of those was called Farmyard Blues, and the other was I can't remember the name of it, but what I'm saying is that they were grade 3 and 4 pieces on the Associated Board. And so they subsequently did more Microjazz piano books, but I also decided to do piano duet books, and at that point they decided, let's do clarinet and piano, flute and piano, etc. And suddenly I had endless amounts of pieces to write for lots of instruments, which in fact is still continuing. One thing which people ask me was, how do you get into publishing? And I say, you've got to have good stuff. but you've also got to have an element of sheer luck, in the sense that you need to find somebody who understands what you've done and gets it. Because in fact, I got a wonderful little anecdote about microjazz and Universal Edition, which I just think is fantastic and it sums it up. In 1985, I think, the trade show in London was full of my books on the Boots and Hawks stand. And a very classically oriented person from Universal Edition came up and said to my guy, whose name is Rex, he said, "How are these going?" Because they kind of knew they'd passed on them. This is the microjazz pieces. And Rex said, "Very well." And the other guy said, "Why do you think that is?" And Rex said, "Good marketing," because he was a marketing person as well. And the guy from Universal pulled himself up to his full 6'2" and said, "Well, it must be, because it certainly isn't the music." And Rex gleefully came around to me and said, "That's why you're with us and not with them, because you need somebody who kind of understands what you've done, you know."
Yes.
But on top of that, there's something else which is interesting, which I didn't realize until years later, and that is I had this very classical background and interest. And when I started to try and write popular pieces like I did with microjazz, I didn't know it, but I was writing things down very, very precisely. Fingering, articulation, pedaling, everything was there. So teachers are no doubt as to what's involved, particularly in articulation terms, because that's the way I'd come up. So, but at the same time, I was writing stuff which sounded kind of authentic. It was voiced right and all that sort of thing. And one little anecdote to tell you, which I think has always stuck in my mind, was soon after microjazz came out, I went to America. I've got a poster in my study here from MTNA in 1987, and it preceded by a tour. I was in Denver, and this keyboard player, I mean, he told me he's a keyboard player, a professional keyboard player, came up to me and said, "Mr. Norton, I got your first 2 books and played the first few pieces and thought, this guy writes like I play." And that's the other secret of microjazz. In fact, I'm writing like pop music players play, or jazz players play, but it's notated like classical music. So it is a real kind of interesting bridge between two worlds, if you like, which I stumbled across by accident. I am a kind of bridge between two worlds in that sense.
Now here's a question which you might not have thought about, but do you think that you have brought something to your career and everything that you do because of your New Zealand background, or have you moved into the international sphere where New Zealand is a remote part of your life now?
No, I still feel very strongly that it wasn't just. I suppose the New Zealand thing was that I was brought up at a country that was slightly isolated, if you like. And also my parents had no knowledge of classical music at all, or any of my family, and so I was left free to kind of find out about music by myself. And so when I got to York University, this is the interesting thing. I mean, some people know this, but it's probably not a well-known fact, is that I was there to do a PhD in composition, which I failed. And they said to me, "We think you'll do the best of anybody who's ever come through here, but why are you here?" In other words, they couldn't get to grips with the fact that I was writing small tonal piano pieces and saying, "This is what I do." I had to be writing atonal music in the style of Della Piccola or whatever, or they wouldn't pass you. And it was the best thing that happened to me, of course, because it propelled me into a freelance career, which is what I've done ever since, and I've become a full-time composer. I became one quite quickly. If I'd gone down the getting the PhD and doing the academic route, I could have ended up in a university job thinking this isn't quite what I wanted to do with my life.
It's interesting because I interviewed an academic here in Australia who is well loved and highly respected by his students for his teaching of harmony. And he set out to be a composer, but he said he was working at a university, but he didn't actually like what he was writing. So he thought he would stop. So it's interesting. You found your voice early on.
I found my voice very early on, and I recognised myself. In fact, you probably know this, but I'm with Boots and Hawks, but I've also got my own publishing venture called 80 Days Publishing, and we've issued a number of things which preceded my coming to Britain. One of them was a series of pieces called Brighton Bluesy, which I wrote when I was 23. So it was before I left New Zealand, and they're still great. And in fact, the Royal Conservatory in Canada, which is a very major examination board, picked up two of the pieces straight away for their grade 7 and 8 syllabus. So I was myself from a very early stage, and I think the reason I mentioned the going through York and sort of stumbling on the academic world was that I just kept being myself and thought I'm just going to do what I do because I had a hunch that that would be the way I would succeed.
Well, I think that's really inspiring. I think for young musicians who are watching this video, they will draw a lot from that. So you mentioned about your own publishing company, but tell me about your life these days. How are the weeks filled, and what are the different activities that you do?
Well, it's still a sort of an interesting range of things. If I look at what I've just got on at the moment, I'm writing a series of pieces for, which is the bottom of the Connections series for 80 Days series for harp, because my company does have a very large range of my pieces under the banner Connections. What happened was I wrote the Connections series in 2005 for the Royal Conservatory, and they quite wisely in a way said to me, look, we know you're under contract to Boosey and Hawkes, but we would like to own the rights to this series. It's a big series because Boosey and Hawkes are doing nothing in North America. This will spread your name around in North America at no cost to them. Would they be prepared to release the copyrights? And they did. But what happened was in 2018, just after I arrived in Canada, they got in touch with me and said, we're getting out of all publications apart from our exam books. Would you like to buy the Connection series from us? So I acquired the entire series, including the copyrights of this series myself. And that became the springboard. So that's the sort of chief thing we sell within 80 days. But we've also become specialists in music for guitar and music for harp, particularly for harp. And I'm writing some grade 1 and 2 pieces at the moment for harp. I've also got, my wife and I between us have written 30 stage musicals for junior school, and they're all being released through 80 Days, but they're all published by Boosey and Hawkes. So I'm actually doing quite a lot of projects where I put them out and disseminate them through my own company, but we pay royalties, license royalties to Boosey and Hawkes, and as I'm paying my own publisher royalties, quite nice, because they do have me on a retainer and pay advance royalties. So I try and give back, if you like. So I'm working on the preparation of 30 stage musicals. We've got a long way down the line for that already.
So tell me.
A sort of freelance job is quite funny, actually. There's a big project for the Royal Conservatory called Sure Start, I think, or Smart Start, which is pieces for like 5-year-olds, junior school, and it's top lines, and they wanted me to write chords to them. They had all these top lines, they wanted me to put chords, so I did that. Then they came back and said, well, actually, we'd like you to do a demonstration play along recording of these, but when it came to what they wanted was a click in and then a pitch reference and then just the tune on the piano. But get this, Mark, there are 680 pieces and they want them by the end of August. So what I'm saying, it's not going to take long, but it is still a big job. So I'm doing that at the same time as well. But also because I've got my own publishing company, I'm publishing quite a lot of other people. And so I've been editing lots and lots of music by third parties as well, which is lovely because I'm encouraging young composers, and not even young composers. I'm just about to put finishing touches to a book of wonderful piano pieces by a guy who's 75 years old. It's his first publication. He's very excited, and he's very, very fussy. So I've enjoyed working with him because he's so kind of laser sharp about what he wants. So I'm enjoying very much the combination of writing things myself, doing arranging work and recording work, and encouraging new things on the market, if you like, through my own venture.
And tell me, you don't have time for your own students, and you haven't really taught your own students for a long time, but you do a lot of classes for other people's students.
I do a lot of master classes. I've just done a big event in Saskatchewan here with the students, and I really like it. I think, in fact, like teaching composition is something I particularly enjoy doing. I feel as though I'm right in the middle now, at last, at the age of 70, of what I'm good at, and so that's why I'm really enjoying it, because I've figured out what I can do, and I'm doing that. As you mentioned with the academic guide in Australia, people can end up doing something they think, I don't really like doing this, or don't want to do it, but I guess I'm kind of stuck with it. I'm now able to kind of concentrate fiercely on what I'm best at, if you like, which is composition and arranging and teaching composition, and to a certain extent teaching piano, because in fact I do master classes and I know exactly what to say. I don't know where it comes from, but students seem to have found it very useful. So that's very nice. But I don't teach privately at all. I haven't really for 40 years.
Yes. And finally, looking to the future, you're a young man. You've only recently turned 70. So,
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of burning ambitions of things that you want to do, or projects that are sort of simmering away in the back of your mind?
No, I mean, I'm not like a writer who's got a novel in them. I'm not trying to write a symphony particularly. I'm just enjoying the range of things that I do. I think it's a funny thing to say, and if things come up, I address them with interest. I'm not somebody who has to write, but when I sit down, I can write. Is that the way to put it? Because
Yes.
my wife's a very fine composer, and she was published. You'll love this. She was published for the first time at the age of 84. So she's a very, very late starter, and she's now got something like 16 publications out. But she only writes when she feels the urge to write. She doesn't write, just sit down and say, I've got to write something, so I'm going to write it. She actually, and she, oh, by the way, she's had a whole raft of commissions which have been very well received from Karen North. You know that name?
Yes.
In Australia.
Yes.
So she's starting to surface in Australia as a writer as well. So that's another thing which gives me great pleasure, is I've been able to partner with her. She's another composer. So we're a very unusual combination of a husband and wife composer team. And I edit and set things for her, but also on the musicals front, we co-write. She writes words and music sometimes. I write words and music sometimes, and we kind of mix it all up, which is lovely.
Wonderful. And last time we met, when you're here in Australia, you were still living in London. Was it a big decision to move to Canada?
Actually, it was my decision. There's various reasons. My wife is Canadian. My first wife, who some people will know and remember, died in 2013, and I'd known Wendy, my second wife, since 2007 as a colleague and friend, and we got married, and she moved to London, and we really enjoyed it. But with Brexit looming, there's one of the things, and also some of the sort of getting into the country aspects for her, because she was on a spousal visa and accidentally overstayed by 2 weeks and ended up getting the third degree that every time she came into the country. And I thought, I think we need to try something else here. And on top of that, I felt as it was nice for her to finally get back to where she came from, which is Ontario. And we both knew Stratford, because I've got another publishing company which published a series called American Pop Piano, which was based in Stratford. So I've been here many times, and it's the most lovely town. It's based on Stratford-on-Avon. It is on the Avon River. It's got 3 theatres, which does lots of Shakespeare, and it's just a perfect small town, 32,000 people, and it's close enough to Toronto. We went to Toronto yesterday, there and back, so it's actually very handy to all the amenities and so on. So we moved to Canada for a variety of reasons, but we just have never regretted it. It was perfect timing. Britain seems like a slightly more hazardous place. If we missed the pandemic in the centre of London, which was wonderful, because it would have been awful we were living in the Barbican, but it still would have been very isolated, living in an apartment, in a 2,000 apartment complex during the pandemic. But as it was, we had a good pandemic living in a house in Stratford.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your musical journey with us, and I look forward to to do the next interview where you will have thought of a whole lot of new things as well. So
yes, well, I mean, I must write a Taron concerto, obviously. That's
you must.
yeah. If I could find the player.
Okay, I'll put my hand up. Thanks so much. Okay, cheers.
Great. Lovely to see you.